right, guys, so welcome to another episode of the Marine Bio Movie Club. Thank you for joining us. Today we are going to be discussing Seaspiracy, and Kendra and I are actually kind of hopping in here as a second recording. We previously recorded an entire episode on Seaspiracy the day after it was released. We both watched it day of. And so our first recording was very much a kind of first reactions to the film. And since then, we have done a lot of research of our own, as well as just sort of seen, I guess, the aftermath of the documentary and what it sort of created within the conservation sphere. And so we wanted to hop on and sort of give some perspective as to sort of maybe some more inaccuracies or issues that we maybe have with the film. I think this is a really good practice to sort of exemplify to all of you, because no matter what documentary you watch, whether it's Seaspiracy or anything else, there's always going to be a sort of agenda behind it or target call to action, I guess. And so it's not to say that it can't still be the best documentary in the world, but there's always going to be some sort of bias. And so we wanted to hop on and kind of talk about just some general fact kind of stuff to shed a little bit of light on maybe some of the things that were sort of twisted to fit the agenda of Seaspiracy. Not to say that it wasn't still a good documentary. It's still something that I would recommend people to watch, but we do have some stuff that we want to add to an understanding of it. We're also going to link a document that Kendra made with a bunch of details and more in-depth sort of stuff and on like fact checking and a lot of that. So that'll be linked in the description below, but we wanted to hop on and kind of have this conversation as well. So Kendra, I guess for you, what's sort of been, after seeing the film and having that kind of first, I would say mostly positive reaction to it, and after doing some research or just looking into more of the information behind the documentary, what are your sort of feelings at this point on it?
Yeah, I still think people should, I think if people want to watch it. I know a lot of people in the community have been saying don't watch it, it's trash, but I still think it's a good starter, but just do more afterwards. Watch other movies, look at books, look at what the experts in the movie have been like responding to about it. Like that was one thing, is a lot of the people that have been interviewed in it have kind of been coming out and saying like they weren't told what it was about, they weren't told they were going to be in it in the end, which like that's Christina Hicks was the professor who talked about subsidies, and she said that she was interviewed like a long time ago and then was never told like she was going to be in the film, what it was really about. She said that they just chatted vaguely with her for a while until I think she just apparently said stuff they liked and they put it in the film, which I mean, I can get like maybe why they did that, which was the whole like, oh, we don't want them to know so that they tell us stuff. But it's also like, for good filmmaking, I feel like you should be going in at least maybe saying this movie is about this and this, can like whatever, you know. I just
Yeah, so
think it's
that
kind of
brings up,
sketchy filmmaking.
yeah, so that brings up one of the issues that I've been noticing, or that even when you watch the film, you can see it in the film, how some of the interviews that they did with like Oceana, Plastic Coalition, not to say that the individuals that were interviewed weren't necessarily like telling the truth or anything. However, it's pretty unethical filmmaking to interview someone and not tell them why you're interviewing them.
Yeah, well, in
Um,
Plastic Pollution Coalition, they came out and said that they were interested in the work that they do, but then they were like being really rude in the process. And obviously like Pollution Coalition is like they don't take a huge stance on fishing just because they focus more on a different area,
yeah,
which
which,
that it was kind of the problem with like not Seaspiracy. Cowspiracy did the same thing with like Greenpeace and Surfrider, which was like my problem with that movie, is I was like, it's Surfrider, they're still great, but it like threw them under the bus.
yeah, so that's kind of something that I kind of fall like middle of the line, because obviously they did sort of unearth the fact that some of these larger conservation organizations are funded by things that maybe are associated with not so conservation based corporations, which is something that happens a lot in all areas of conservation, whether it be the ocean, rainforest, whatever it is. So it did kind of unearth that fact that that does happen. However, I do think it sort of created this movement within the ocean conservation world where people then started to go and start attacking conservation organizations that are doing a lot of good work just because they didn't say you should go vegan, which to each their own, like that's a personal choice. I always tell people, I'm like, yeah, if you want to make the biggest difference when it comes to seafood, that's the best way to do it. Doesn't mean it's the only answer. But I think a lot of people became very frustrated with learning about those things and then started pointing the finger at a lot of different conservation organizations like, oh, did you see Seaspiracy? Do you agree with this? Do you agree with that? Oh, no, wrong answer. Sorry. I'm not going to support you anymore.
That was literally the Four Ocean exchange I posted.
Yeah. So,
because, yeah, Four Ocean shared they had shared something and someone commented like, are you against fisheries? And they were like, no, like we support sustainable fisheries, like we're against obviously bad practices.
Yeah, so it is hard. Obviously, like with Sea Shepherd, you and I have both talked about how the organization itself has been somewhat problematic outside of this documentary. And so we do, at least for me, and I'm sure you've talked about this as well, there is a little bit of this issue with now the documentary, not to say that Oceana and Plastic Pollution Coalition don't have their own issues, but they sort of like push down a lot of conservation organizations to lift Sea Shepherd up on this like high pedestal.
Yeah.
Which I don't necessarily, it's hard because obviously they still also do good work.
Yeah, they have good projects.
I don't think they necessarily deserve the crown of best conservation organization out there.
Yeah, people were even commenting like, because I made a funny TikTok about it, and they were like, I thought Sea Shepherd was great. Like, what are you talking about? And I was like, oh my gosh, first of all, like, no, but every organization is going to have problems. Sea Shepherds is just like, I've heard issues from a personal level, like from people who have been in their organization, people who have worked around their volunteers. And then there's like the general public stuff where they're really extreme and really polarizing.
They did also sort of encourage people in a way to go after some organizations that, sure, okay, are they doing some not great things? Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily discredit all the good work that they've done.
Well, more so like things you don't agree. Like Oceana just says like, if you're gonna eat seafood, eat this kind of seafood. Mm-hmm. And like they have the tagline of like,
people weren't happy with that answer.
Yeah, but it's like that's a good answer for a lot of people.
Yeah, and
like it's not the answer the movie wanted.
That kind of comes into the other issues that we already previously talked about that we have with the documentary, is that they didn't focus a lot on solutions, or the only solution they provided was to go vegan, which, like we already said, I don't have anything against going vegan. I personally have not made that choice for myself. I'm pretty much a vegetarian other than like sustainable options. But yeah. I think it's unrealistic to expect every person that watches a documentary to go vegan.
Yeah.
Not to say that that maybe isn't the best answer, because I'm sure it is. However, I think that it almost becomes ineffective to some degree because people assume that, oh, well, I'm not willing to go 100% vegan, so I'm not going to do anything differently.
Yeah, well, I think that was one thing in Cowspiracy is I think he even brought up like the go meatless one day thing and kind of like debunked it. Not debunked it, but was like, that's not enough. That was my thing where I was like, provide that solution. Yes. Like I don't eat seafood. I haven't for years. I just got vegan sushi that I ate. Right. But then provide like the steps for the other two solutions they gave. And people were like, they didn't have time. It was like, they had time to put a slide at the end to go to websites. That is not an excuse. They could have done that.
Yeah. So I think that's other than the fact that they really didn't talk to anyone that like does fisheries science, or at least they did, but not about fisheries science.
Yeah, they talked to like the professors who work in fisheries, but it was like the subsidies portion, which people in fisheries agree subsidies are a problem, which is also why they're like, we don't like your movie, but we agree that's a problem. Why didn't we talk about how the audience can help get rid of subsidies?
Yeah, so I think that's more kind of the struggle, is that, and we talked about this when we previously recorded, which you guys will see here in a second, but we talk about how there's not a lot of time given to solutions, or just really
would have been a cool series.
Yeah, or just really any solution other than becoming vegan. And we already touch on this again in what you'll hear in a second, but there are sustainable forms of fishing that they don't address, and they also don't address like indigenous fishing practices and things like that most of the time are extremely sustainable, but that maybe aren't sort of the like picture perfect version of fishing or whatever that they're trying to portray.
Yeah. Well, and one thing is like a lot of people have been saying, well, the movie wasn't meant for these other countries that rely on fishing. It's meant for like the Western world. But I think people forget that there are indigenous people that live in the Western world. Like in Hawaii, there are like native Hawaiians who still like fish is a part of your culture. It's not like, so I'm sure there are lots of like native Hawaiians who are going to like give up seafood, don't eat seafood, but it's still a part of Hawaiian culture.
Right. And I
like
think
those fish ponds and all that kind of stuff.
The reality is too, is that majority of, I'm not an indigenous person, so I can't speak obviously to it on experience, but those people that I have met are some of the most sustainable fishers on the planet, it seems like. So
on top of
it's one of those things where there was a lot that they could have talked about, but they didn't, because it wasn't pushing that vegan agenda, which is fine. But I think as someone that watches it, it's sort of your responsibility, like, oh, that's cool. I don't really want to be a vegan, but there are things you can do. So it's finding those sort of like intermediate solutions that can allow for that.
Or at least like just by providing like actions for those other two, that if the people who watched it and are turned off by the plant-based message could at least do something else. And at least on their website, that was my thing. I like their website. The only like they show the 3 solutions, and the only like they have a hyperlink to a food subscription plan they're selling, but they don't have anything more about the other 2 solutions, which I was kind of like, you have a whole website, like, come on. Come on.
For sure. So so there's lots of things obviously that were maybe not exactly the best.
It's not a picture perfect documentary.
No, it's,
to be fair, most are not.
And I think the part for me that I found most disheartening was this sort of divide that it created between, I guess, like conservationists and scientists in a way. That it is amazing that people watched this documentary and felt so passionate about wanting to help the ocean. I think that is a great thing. However, when actual fisheries scientists are telling you real data that they've taken, or telling you like, hey, this stat that they used about derelict fishing gear making up this percentage of ocean plastic was actually only the number for the Pacific garbage patch, not the entire ocean. Not to say that it's not still a big issue, but maybe look into the numbers and realize that it maybe doesn't make up as big of a percentage as what you thought. Not to say it's not still important, but
I think that's been the biggest thing is people, when scientists have been saying like, that's not accurate, they're like, oh, so it's not a problem. It's like, no, that is not. It's still an issue we can be passionate about. Like 10% of ocean pollution being fishing gear related is a problem. It's more concentrated in other areas. That's where like when we like get the facts right, the activism can be right. And like, let's focus our attention on how to get it out of that specific area where it's happening really badly.
Yes. It's been great that people care so much. However, I think whether you're, I mean, even watching it as marine biologists, it's our responsibility as well to go and look more into the issues that they're talking about, and be open to other information from other people, and to not only fact check the documentary that we watched, but also the people that we're getting information from. Like, please go fact check us, you know, like,
Yeah.
And so it's been hard to watch. And I remember you said, like, Paul Watson posted something like, we don't need scientists anymore, we need
His whole post
activists.
was just, ugh. Yeah, he said a lot of different things, like people are nitpicking because they've been exposed, which it's like, no, a lot of us don't work in fisheries.
Yeah. Well, I think
We're not.
the reality is that they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and that's like, that was the thing with his act. Like, the very last line was, we need more activists than scientists. And I was like, no, let's not push that.
I think we definitely need more activists. We also
need more activists, but like, we also need scientists. We need your everyday person watching the movie
about.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, people were like, well, the scientists, I think at one point he had said something where like, the scientists don't do much. And I was like, your movie wouldn't have like half of its stats without scientists. Like, they weren't the most correct, to be fair, but either way, who'd they come from? Without that, you would have had just the video footage, which it's emotional, so it would get something done. But like, those facts are really what drove it home. Like, people are commenting on pages like, did you know by 2048 there'll be no fish left in the sea? Did you know that 46% of fishing gear is, or fishing pollution is actually fishing gear? And like, attacking random organizations that are selling like microfiber filters. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was where I was like, you wouldn't have those numbers that people are so not happy about, but like, using without scientists. So I would say your film proves otherwise.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think ultimately we mostly just wanted to hop on here and sort of discuss a few of the issues that we had with the film, encourage you to do your own fact checking. We've kind of, or Kendra's gotten a list together of things in the movie, just like facts and things, sort of like, this is what's
just like more context for other things. Like,
there's lots of things like that. So that's all linked in the document below. I'll also put in some links for some documentaries that go more in depth on a lot of the topics that are hit in Seaspiracy. And that is why I still recommend this documentary, because they hit so many different topics regarding sharks and slavery at sea and whaling and tons of different things. Taiji, you know, the list goes on. They hit so many different topics, and that was one of the biggest positives that I took away from the film. But there's lots of documentaries, if you are wanting to learn more about these specific topics, that go way more in depth and really focus on one topic. And they're really great documentaries. I'm sure they're ones that we will probably eventually review on here as well. But I'll link some of those below, so that way if you are wanting to learn more and reading is less of your thing and movies more are so, like me, then you'll have those also available.
And 2 are free on Water Bear.
Okay.
So if we want to link Water Bear.
Yes, can do that as well. Yeah, so you're about to hear sort of our first reactions to the film, and sort of keep in mind. I think we
recorded the day it came out, though.
Either day it came out or day
I think it was technically the day, but I had watched it as it premiered, fallen asleep, woken up, and I think we filmed.
Right. So it's a really first reactions.
It was fresh. Like, people were not coming out with stuff. And obviously, I think we even said, like, we're going to look into it more. This is initial.
Yeah. So the next little bit that you're going to see are our initial reactions, and sort of just keep in mind what we just talked about. And yeah, hope you guys enjoy it. And we're really excited to discuss this documentary. We both actually just watched it yesterday when it first came out, and we have a lot to say, both good and bad. But yeah, if you want to, I mean, do you have any just opening thoughts on the documentary, Kendra?
I overall did really like it. I'm just pulling up my list. Mm-hmm. I like how many things it covered.
Yes.
Instead of kind of just focusing solely, I mean, obviously the theme was sustainable fishing, But it really went into plastic, taiji, shark finning, seabird. I mean, and all of them are going to be linked to seafood, but it goes into like the specific metrics, which I really liked.
I think they did a really good job of showing just how interconnected all conservation issues are just in general.
Yeah, I liked the issues with like carbon sinks, human trafficking, and just like the human rights issue involved as well, because that's a big one that turned me off from the fisheries industry.
I think too, just in general, a lot of times with documentaries, you see them focus on one issue very specifically. And yes, while the documentary obviously is primarily discussing issues within like commercial fishing, they did a really good job of, like I mentioned, intertwining those other conservation issues. And like you were saying, with discussing other topics of interest and other things that were happening around the world and how that's sort of all linked back to this issue when it comes to fisheries. I think it helps honestly build a better argument for whatever they're trying to persuade than it does if you only look at it from one side, kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I agree. I thought it was a really good documentary. There's definitely some things that I have comments on and thoughts and feelings and all that kind of stuff. The first thing they sort of talk about, and the documentary filmmaker who appeared to have made the film and who kind of like narrates the film, I did not like his voice, but that's a personal issue, not anything to do with him.
Wow.
But one of the first things he talks about is how he grew up loving the ocean and fell in love with the ocean and decided he wanted to do something about it. And then as he did more research, sort of was faced with more the reality of the oceans and like how much trouble they're in. And I wrote this down because I can relate, and I'm sure many marine biologists and ocean conservationists can, in that it's pretty common, I feel like, within the field of work that we're in to have really high highs and really low lows, and to one day have this amazing experience where you see an animal you've always wanted to see in the wild, and then the next you're hearing about how everybody's killing said animal, you know? So I just felt like I could really relate to his perspective of kind of this like hopelessness, I guess. It's really easy, I feel like, as conservationists to kind of get to this point where you're like, there's no point, you know, like it's worthless, there's no point. I don't know if you saw Maddie Sinclair, Mads Ocean just posted kind of a short film a little bit ago, and she talks about this same sort of phenomenon where as conservationists, you go from having these amazing experiences to these really sort of heart-wrenching realities of what's happening in our ocean. It's really easy to sort of be discouraged where one moment, and at least for me, I feel like this with sharks in particular, or just with the ocean in general, one moment you are like, I'm going to fight as hard as I can. I'm going to do everything possible. And then the next moment you're like, why do I even try? There's no point. The Earth's going to die in 10 years anyway. So,
yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that was sort of how the documentary opened up, just because I felt like I could relate to it a lot.
Yeah, it does really good getting you invested in that from the get-go.
But I guess kind of the first thing he talks about is taiji, which I personally don't have a ton of like firsthand experience with, but I have friends like Natalie, Nadine, who are involved in the Dolphin Project, who have gone to taiji many times and shared information about the dolphin slaughters that happen there. And I've seen, so most of the footage that I saw in the documentary, I had already seen that footage, if not similar footage before. So the reality of it wasn't that different to me, but I did think they took like an interesting stance with like the whole pest control perspective.
Yeah, I knew about that because my professor in university is in fisheries. And so he talks about not the nuance, annoying how dolphins can be. with the fishing industry, and he very much, and he's very good at challenging very typical conservation beliefs. And we were talking about it, I think one day we were like walking back from a lab, and he brought up this whole thing about how dolphins really do cause an issue for a lot of fisheries, and that he's like, I understand people are upset when people kill dolphins, but he points out that the same thing happens with land animals, where we will manage predators that we may be in competition with. And he kind of, and it is like that point at the end with the fisherman where he's like, it's a life. There is like the difference of cognitive ability that we do akin with cetaceans, which is why we tend to be more emotionally invested in their slaughters. But it really, technically, when you get down to it, a life is a life, and it should be considered, like, he thinks it should be like seen as equal. And if you're going to fight one, fight both, which there are people that fight both. But I think the energy is definitely very different. But overall, you can also argue, well, we don't need to be exploiting the fish to where we are in such direct competition with cetaceans to that degree.
So I definitely understand the perspective of the fishermen when it comes to that, because a lot of times, unless you have this sort of deeper understanding of how ecosystems work, as fishermen, what you're seeing is, I'm catching fish, dolphin, shark, whatever it is taking fish off my line or out of my net or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you're not seeing necessarily long-term effect. You're seeing that short-term, immediate detriment to your fish stock. So I can definitely understand the frustration building. I think it's unfortunate that and to your point, I agree in that we can't just treat one animal one way and not another, like we can't say, oh, well, you can't kill this animal, but this one's fine. Or, I think there's a little bit more nuance in all of that, which is hard to sort of rationalize and discuss, I guess. But I don't know. It's just a very, like, let's sort of bury this slaughter of the dolphins and the fact that we're taking some of them to put into captivity.
Yeah. Like, I do find it interesting they don't bring up the fact that they actually will sell the dolphin meat. They don't sell a lot of it from what I have seen.
It's not the big ticket item.
No, it's not. But some of the meat is sold on the market. And there has actually been a big push by a lot of higher up Japanese officials, again, with like the whaling. They don't talk about why they restart whaling. For some reason, some people in Japan want to bring back whaling because they think they should be more connected to their ancient roots of fishing, which I do think it's kind of where you dance the line of a culture and like a respectful way to whale. There is a way to do it right. I really think a lot of native cultures do it very sustainably, literally using the entire animal. That's where I don't like a broad stroke of everyone needs to be vegan. Killing all animals is wrong. But the Japanese, I think, kind of have they push this idea that they want to bring back the culture of eating whale.
But that's not really what it's about.
That's not really what it's about. And a lot of people in Japan really don't eat whale. There isn't a demand. It's not necessary, which is kind of why. And even people within Japan, there are people who do know about taiji and don't like it and will be cove monitors and fight against the whole industry. And I watched Whale Wars growing up.
Well, you can't point at an entire country and say everybody agrees that this is okay. That's just they talk about how a lot of it's pest control, some of it's captive. As they sort of discover this like tuna fishery while they're looking at the dolphins, they discover the sharks, and then they talk a little bit about shark finning, and sort of the corruption within that system as well, how it sort of not directly but almost indirectly aligns with a lot of criminal activity. Which is a point that they make further on in talking just about commercial fishing in general. But what I really appreciated when it came to the shark conversation is they talked about finning, they talked about how it's a huge issue, but and obviously the documentary itself is about commercial fishing, so it makes sense that they talked about bycatch, but that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
That I try and really talk to people about when it comes to sharks, because to the point that they made in the documentary, finning, yes, awful. Responsible for a huge portion of sharks taken out of our oceans. However, bycatch is almost just as bad, if not worse nowadays.
Yeah.
And a lot of
especially
people don't hear about it.
Yeah, and with finning, kind of, it is becoming more and more less common. Like, I remember I took a conservation biology class and we watched videos of young people in Taiwan who were making like promotional content that they spread around about not participating in the shark fin industry. And obviously it's still like, they went to Hong Kong, we see that it is still happening.
Yeah.
But I think, we're seeing it get smaller more and more, and that bycatch really is another very big driving factor that I see a lot of people talk about bycatch, but it may just be because of who I know. Maybe it really isn't spread as much as finning. Obviously finning, I think
when it comes to the general public, it's not as commonly, at least when it comes to sharks, it's not
I think finning is
about. And I think that's kind of almost what the documentary implies, is that people don't talk about commercial fishing, people don't talk about bycatch. And
I mean, even like if you look at the big corporations that they almost like point out, they will talk about finning, and a lot of bigger companies will talk about finning, but maybe not so much the impact fishing has, which that does have a lot of merit, that whole.
But yeah, I mean, the documentary did a good job about mentioning finning, also mentioning the bycatch, which obviously fits more the agenda of the overall documentary.
Yeah.
And clearly finning is still a really big issue. That doesn't mean that we should forget that finning exists and not talk about it anymore. It's still a huge problem. But it is worth mentioning, right, that like the bycatch thing is almost worse sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and people can kind of do more on a personal level to potentially decrease bycatch versus finning, because not most of us are not encountering shark fin soup. We can sign petitions, but it's happening.
Or encourage others to,
or encourage others to, but
tangible.
It's not like you are regularly offered or are seeing shark fin soup that you're not like you're not actively purchasing and putting your money into, whereas most people go to seafood restaurants, buy seafood without maybe looking into it, which we talk about
for sure.
All that kind of stuff.
I wish they would have mentioned, because it would have fit their rhetoric, I wish they would have mentioned how shark is often listed as other things, because I think that would have been another an interesting add-on to their commercial fishing like agenda. But
I definitely think they could have added about like how often fish is like just mixed. Like shark can be in it and just other random species. They kind of did like talk about
options.
Yeah, that there's more to seafood as well, like how unhealthy. I mean, they kind of talk about like
they do about with the omegas and things like that.
But there is the other level.
Oh, for sure. But I mean,
there's only so much you can do in an hour and a half.
They already talked about so much in this documentary, so it's not like they already hit a lot of points. We're just
they hit a ton.
Things
they hit a lot.
Even more talk about. But they do kind of move from like the sharks and talking about bycatch. Obviously, they also talk about other animals being caught as bycatch: sea turtles, seals, whales, birds, all that sort of stuff. They talk about that as well. And then they kind of move into talking a little bit just about like how poorly regulated commercial fishing, especially in international waters, is. And a lot of that honestly is true. It's pretty horribly regulated. Part of it is that it's not like when you're driving down the street and there's already an infrastructure of having people around, having police around. It's really hard, even as a country, to enforce things that are happening out on the ocean, especially out in the middle of the ocean.
Well, it's hard to enforce things on land.
Yeah.
And that's far more tangible to like put a police station in the middle of nowhere where there may be an issue,
right,
versus in the middle of the ocean. So that's part of it. There's only so much you can do.
Yeah, and they do talk a little bit about observers and sort of the corruption in that system as well, which I don't necessarily have like firsthand experience, but we did have um, an observer come out on one of our boats, and out of curiosity, I asked about, oh, the bycatch and all that kind of stuff, and obviously like he claimed he's under NDAs, he's not allowed to discuss, which fair enough, you know.
Yeah.
I was just
I have a friend who works as an observer in the Ross Sea.
And he did mention and he works as an observer here in Hawaii's longline, which our longline industry is technically considered the most sustainable longline industry in the world. However, just because it's the most sustainable does not necessarily mean that it is sustainable.
Yeah.
The reason it is considered so sustainable is because there are catch limits for things like monk seals and turtle species, to where if they catch a certain number, their season will end. However, there is no catch limit on things like sharks. So that's where you kind of get into this sort of like gray area.
There's the conversation of, is it even sustainable? Because like with a monk seal, even one.
Right. And
that's, which is kind of, they touch on that in the movie.
And they do with our local longline. They do have those limits. So technically, yes, that does make it, I guess, more sustainable than a fishing
that doesn't
longline that has none.
Yeah.
They do often also label Hawaii's longline as local seafood because it is caught by Hawaii's local longline. However, they are permitted to fish over halfway to California, so not really sure how local that would be considered. But yeah, so I don't necessarily have experience, and I don't know if your friend has said anything about where he or she works as an observer. But even talking to the observer that I spoke to, obviously he wasn't allowed to share that much information with me, which, you know, fair enough. I'm not asking him to breach contract, but it was kind of clear that even he was like sort of hinting to this idea of not necessarily that he could be bribed, but it was kind of like, I didn't get the impression that he was the most trustworthy human being in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that was what
on my point, but still.
The guy they talked to in the film, where he was like, yeah, it's sustainable depending on how you're defining that. And I liked that he was so like abrasive about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people are gonna be like, what a jerk. I'm like, no, I think he's being very apparent that sustainable means what it means for the fishing industry. Yeah. And he's like, that it is not. And the same is with greenwashing. They call it blue washing in the film, but like even with like our products, with just plastic issues and even like hair care issues, like when things are greenwashed, it depends on what you're meaning by the word sustainable. Sustainable and eco-friendly are words that are not regulated, and it can mean whatever they want to mean. It's not like compostable, where the word compostable is regulated. Something has to meet requirements to have that thrown on. Someone could just throw on these other terms.
Oh, 100%.
What they're bringing up.
That was a really good point. I think that was a great point that the documentary made.
Like humans.
In that kind of a repeating theme was that what one industry considers sustainable does not actually necessarily mean sustainable, or what does even sustainable mean?
And it may vary individually. Like, whereas I don't eat any seafood. I will eat, if I was to eat it, I always was saying if my friend spear caught it and it was a friend I trusted that understood the reef system around us.
My opinion is that the only truly sustainable forms of fishing are spearfishing as an individual, or single line and hook as an individual.
And very local. I'm very tired. I would love to like exclusively very much support like local communities, natives, especially like in Hawaii, where that is. Like, there was an amazing poke place right by my house, and the owner would go out, and he was Kanaka, would go out every single week, multiple times, and fish, and everything was fresh, and he caught them by himself on his boat. And there were weeks where obviously like it was lower, so there weren't as much product, and weeks where like weather was bad, he wasn't open. kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Which I think that is a great way to support fishing that is in a truly, in
More
my
sustainable.
term of sustainable.
I don't really like fish, just because I just don't. It has nothing to do with my opinions on fishing methods or whatever. I just have never really loved fish.
I only like crustaceans.
Me too.
And mahi. I do like mahi.
Yeah, I like shrimp. I like crab, lobster, scallop, that kind of stuff.
Scallops.
But yeah, I've never been a big fish person. So personally, it's never really been that big of an issue for me to avoid
Did
seafood.
you like sushi?
The only seafood or sushi I'll eat are like California rolls because it's crab.
See, I will only really eat fish when they're seafood or deep fried. So that part was hard for me to move away from, but there are great vegan alternatives.
Right. And so like for me personally, it's never been, I am
huge.
Just by choice, I guess, or not even, I'm not necessarily like veggie, but I basically am. I would say if I had 10 meals in a period of time, maybe one would include meat of some sort.
Yeah.
I just personally am not a huge meat eater. However, my boyfriend, huge meat eater. He grew up in a family where if there wasn't a protein with dinner, it wasn't necessarily considered like a proper meal kind of thing.
Yeah.
So very different. And I don't know. I personally am never been one to be like, you have to be a vegan or you have to be vegetarian. And that is a lot of what this movie sort of pushes.
Which makes sense.
And I think that there are great ways that if you want to continue to eat seafood or continue to eat meat in whatever capacity, if you can find things like spear fishermen that will sell you fish or whatever it is, that's a better option. When it comes to like ethically eating meat and seafood and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But obviously there's a lot of nuance to it. And just like in our captivity talk, I think there's a lot of kind of trying to accept like the reality of what we live in.
Yeah.
I have met plenty of people, vegan is not an option for them. Even if you could convince them that it tasted good, it doesn't matter kind of thing. Like that's just not something that they're open to doing. And I think just the reality is you have to accept the fact that there are people out there that's just too closed-minded, too stubborn.
Yeah.
Whatever it is to even give that option a chance. So I think the best that we can do is trying to create these more sustainable options, but to the point of the documentary, how do we define that? How do we put an actual enforcement and regulation on this industry?
Yeah. Who do we trust to do to like
that can provide better answers to that question, basically. Do I think everyone should watch this documentary? 100%. Do I think it's going to convince every person that watches it to become a vegan? No.
No.
So there
needs to be an option.
There needs to be a realistic sort of like, not necessarily compromise.
There needs to be more advice
sort of meld.
Do not do this one thing.
Yes.
Because many of us will take that and I've looked into
or how can we help people get closer to that? Like I love the idea of like meatless Monday. It's just a little thing that you can do, or you can start implementing, okay, not just once a week, maybe twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, or whatever it is.
I think that is like my bigger complaint with the film, because I can't really speak to the nitty-gritty accuracies of the
claims
they brought up, whereas I know some other people are evaluating the film as we speak and will be speaking on it, which I'm excited to hear because I am always open to the contrary side, whatever, especially with fisheries biologists. And fisheries biologists saying like not everything in this film is accurate because it is such a broad stroke, and it's okay to admit that obviously a film that's just the end
it's
is
only
saying,
an hour.
And
or an hour and a half or whatever, like you can only fit so much information and they already put in a lot.
And it just says don't eat fish, that is obviously very broad stroked. There are like we both said local fisheries, small scale fisheries that they don't bring in and talk about. And they kind of talk about local with the situation in Africa, that there are local fishermen that are trying to feed their family, but there are also local fishermen everywhere that you can turn to. And that is more sustainable from the technical point. A lot of times local fishermen, and obviously there are going to be local fishermen that don't care also, but they tend to they may understand the ecosystem. I know with spear fishermen, knowing like there are size limits,
right? There's rules
that kind of
and
but it all just depends on the person. And that is one of my issues, is just a broad stroke, one solution of don't eat fish. I'm just like, I can do that. I have no issue doing that. But I can't expect
a good argument for it in this documentary, I will say.
Yes, they do.
And to my point, I do think that everyone should watch this documentary because it doesn't just talk about becoming a vegan. It also talks about so many other really important issues in the ocean that people should be aware of.
Yeah, everyone should watch it. But
and it definitely highlights the issues with the commercial fishing industry, or some of them.
Yeah. But just be like open to, when you hear a point against it, that it doesn't debunk the whole. I think that's part of the problem people have with any kind of film, especially like, I think like we talked about Blackfish, when someone says, oh, that's not true, they then just immediately assume you're on the contrary, like the opposite side. But that's not, you can be against claims in a movie, especially in documentaries, not just because the documentary doesn't mean everything's right. And people making that film are biased, and going into watching it, I think people should be accepting when they will hear maybe an argument against it, to consider it and not be like, ooh, you don't want to save the ocean.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, any documentary has an agenda.
Yeah.
It could be the best agenda in the world.
That's why they're fun.
To save world hunger, to save the ocean, to save the planet, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's an end goal. The end goal of this film was to convince people not to eat seafood or not to support commercial fishing.
Yeah, to look into it and not.
But I think that if you watch any documentary or read any article or any scientific publication or any whatever, that you should do your own research on it as well.
Yeah, it's always hard to stay on. Like, I have bias. When I first watched it, of course, I saw the glowing like inspiration the film's going to bring, and then I go online and I see the fisheries biologists that I follow who are watching it with more of a dread feeling that their industry is going to get hit in their job, and as this woman I'm talking to, she's a fisheries biologist getting her master's, that's obviously going to impact maybe how she is on social media. People may find a post. I mean, I got hate for a post encouraging people to eat sustainable seafood.
Oh yeah, I remember.
So I can't even imagine.
Prepare after we release this episode that all the fishermen, and I say fishermen because overwhelmingly it is the men that come at me angrily. Not all the time.
Mine were teenagers.
Angry fisherwomen. There have been plenty, and a lot of times,
I would say predominantly
it's people that work in commercial fishing. It's Billy Bob Joe who's fishing bass out of his backyard pond.
Right? That's what happened on my post. It was
like, I'm not telling you can't do that, Billy Bob.
It was just people who mainly fish recreationally, or I was like, you're not my problem. Oh my gosh, did you anyway?
Yeah.
But
did you read anything that I said?
I literally left a comment. I was like, all of you showed me you did not read my post, because in no part of, I mean, obviously I was promoting No Fish November.
Still
No Fish February. Fish Free February.
I didn't have anything to say about you.
I didn't even point fingers. They were like, the US is the best fishing, and I was like, I did not claim anyone's worse. I don't think that that's a fair argument, because every industry has faults in every country. It is not anyway.
It's just,
and then they were like, you're stupid. Someone called me racist because, and I was like, it was ridiculous. Maybe we'll like, I don't know.
No, but I fully expect that this episode is going to get a lot of backlash, because people are very strongly opinionated about this.
And on both sides.
Just when it comes to communication in general, you can't have an argument with someone who's not willing to receive your points, if that makes sense. It's not an argument. You're just yelling at a brick wall. So unless the other side is willing to listen and have a conversation, it's unproductive.
Yeah. And that's just that's why, like, if you're going to comment, I definitely think the like questions, like asking Oceana, like, will you change now? Will you explain your sustainable fishery? Because Oceana does talk about how,
or do you have a comment on
the film,
your connection to sponsorships with commercial fishing?
Yeah, because Oceana does talk about how eating sustainable seafood can help seafood, which is a fair statement when you look at that. Obviously, a sustainable fishery does more than a non-sustainable fishery. So they are saying, and I think that
they're saying if you're going to choose one of the evils, choose the lesser of two evils, you know?
Yeah, which
is an argument.
Yeah. And as a big corporation, it's like that makes sense. They're gonna say something like that versus don't eat seafood. Cause which that was my issue with Cowspiracy as well. Cowspiracy did similar things to Greenpeace and Surfrider. And I was like, it's hard to broad stroke, like they may be focused on a different issue. And instead of saying don't eat seafood, saying eat.
Well, I think, and to like what we just talked about, we both are kind of under the mindset of like, you don't need to cut it out completely if you can find better alternatives.
Yeah.
So I think to the same point, maybe that it is that kind of, the reality is that telling someone they have to be a vegan a lot of times gets a full stop from whoever you're trying to talk to.
Yeah.
People have for whatever reason, veganism has been associated with something that like people are not willing to listen to.
Yeah. I was vegan for a bit and then I had to stop because I got an eating disorder. And so and obviously like that is not happening to everyone. I used it as an excuse to develop an eating disorder. And so I am very wary of going full vegan because that tends to happen when I do try. So personally, that is one thing. I am not full vegan. I say more like we try to stay plant-based and we look for alternatives. Like I'm loving mushrooms and finding different kinds of mushrooms to replace meats. I found out lion's mane tastes like shrimp and I am looking for some because I miss shrimp like crazy.
Just ways to sort of find other alternatives. Yeah. And I think that's a great way to do it. I think that's a great way to do it.
Yeah. And so that's one thing that I think should be like kind of brought up. Like it's okay to not just straight out cut out all fish.
Yeah, but I think too maybe the documentary,
but many people can do
it effective if that was the case, you know. Yeah. But I don't know. But they do talk a little bit about how like fishing gear makes up such a huge portion of plastic pollution, which I thought was an awesome point to make, especially after like helping out with things like the net shed here at.
I love the net shed.
Yeah. And so helping with those projects and different
things. When seeing corals wrapped up with nets.
Yeah, and I think it's all just, that kind of stuff. It's a really good point that the documentary made, that it does a lot of times come, even though as a single human being, there is not much I can do to take fishing nets out of the ocean. There's some, like if I see it, I can take it, but I'm not out in the middle of the ocean picking up giant bundles of net.
Yeah.
But it does sort of point to this sort of like, why do we always talk about straws and not big industry? You know, like why do we not make that connection? So I thought that was cool that they brought that up and sort of like brought about this sort of like every little individual thing that you can do helps, but it doesn't mean that you should. I think when I talk to people, I'm like, everything that you can do helps. Don't think that you not using your straw, not using plastic baggie, whatever it is, isn't helping, because it is.
Yeah.
But don't feel bad if you slip up 1% of the time, because ultimately it's not your individual effort that's polluting the ocean. It comes down to the bigger industries, but you trying to make a difference can make a difference.
Yeah. And that's huge.
There are sort of sometimes these like background sponsors or donors that maybe could influence,
you don't want to upset
a organization's
there's dirty money
efforts.
A lot of things,
you know. I mean, we see it here in Hawaii we were trying to pass a bill to help protect sharks and rays out here, and we were seeing that things like some of the aquariums and things out here were trying to support other organizations to come in and sort of like stop the bill, basically. Like they didn't want to outright say it because it's not really good press for them to be like, we're trying to stop a bill to protect animals. But, or we could talk about how the long line, we could talk about how the long line is a huge donor to some of the seaquariums over here.
Not surprising.
So
there's dirty money. I mean, that's
idea.
That's an issue up here as well with the lower four Snake River dams and looking at trying to get Chinook salmon repopulated to have food for the southern residents. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of organizations that are not taking a stand against the dams, even though tons of statistics prove that getting rid of the dams will increase salmon production. It will increase tourism because the killer whales will be back. Mm-hmm. It will give the entire area more money, but there are a lot of big organizations that do not take a stand and are pushing other solutions that are good but small scale. When it comes down to it, orcas cannot live without food. And it doesn't matter what other things we do when they don't have food. And it's frustrating because there is dirty money. There's dirty money in every level of conservation. Yeah.
And I mean, to some degree, it can be a little unavoidable, but I did think it was interesting that it brought up a good point to, as a consumer, do a little research into the organizations that you're supporting. It's not necessarily to say that every single conservation organization out there has an alternative agenda or is being supported by groups that have alternative agendas.
Well, and I definitely don't think Oceania will see a huge, I mean, Greenpeace was not hit, I would say, hugely by Cowspiracy. They now do advocate for a more plant-based diet or incorporating it since the film has come out. They still have tons of supporters. They still have tons of money. I think Oceania will
to more, if you are going to choose to donate somewhere or to show your support somewhere, do a little research. It's not to say that every organization is bad.
And some people may look at Oceania and be like, I understand what you mean by sustainable versus non-sustainable. This doesn't affect me supporting you. Mm-hmm. Whereas others are commenting and saying, F you.
Yeah. They brought up marine protected areas, which I thought is a great thing to talk about because they are extremely important. There's not enough of them. The regulations that we do have that they brought up, I didn't know the exact statistic. I knew that it was extremely disproportional how many areas were considered no take versus just protected. I think the example that they gave of the only thing they protected the area from were the kayakers is a very extreme example of this.
Yeah, that's one that I was like, I definitely am going to look into more.
Yes, however, it does happen where marine protected areas can have different levels of protection.
Yeah.
And even within some marine protected areas, there's kind of zones where this particular area is a no take, but as you sort of get farther away from the epicenter, certain things are allowed and certain things aren't. So it definitely brought up some good points. I personally think that there should be way more marine protected areas out there.
Especially with the data we have from the areas that
show they actually make the whole ocean better.
Yeah, even with these limited amounts of even though they're not fully protected, even being partially protected, we're seeing an improvement in the areas, which that's what my thought was. Because I knew that they obviously weren't super regulated. But I've also seen many studies talking about how MPAs have had an increase in biodiversity, in population in other areas. So if we did create absolute no take MPAs in areas, what that would do without the little.
And they do talk about it. I mean, obviously fast is relative, but they do talk about how the ocean does bounce back relatively quickly when given the chance.
I always think of the humpback population for Hawaii. They bounce back faster than was projected. Obviously not within a week.
Right. And that's what I mean. But it's not fast, but it's
not immediate
quick enough, you know. And I mean, there needs to be more non-fishing areas, at least from commercial fishing.
Yeah, that's one thing I think everyone takes it personally. It's not an aim at like the local small scale fishers. Like I think it really should be a broad stroke. Industrial commercial is where the finger is pointed.
Yeah.
Is where we see.
I mean, marine protected areas are a great way to help protect different species, different ecosystems. They can be difficult to establish, both because of the regulation that's required, but also just because when it comes down, let's say that it depends on the species, but in the past there have been difficulties with certain species of fish, or for example, like sea turtles that nest in one area and forage in another and mate in another, to figure out, okay, well, if they're doing all of this in 3 different locations and we don't have the ability to protect that whole region, or we have to pick one of the 3, what's the most important?
Yeah.
You know,
when with like migratory species, when they're in, I mean, look at what happened in the Galapagos last summer. We had with Hope, the whale shark that just vanished, had that last ping and was gone and had left the safe zone. That as long as they're in that area, but a migratory species, once they leave, are fair game, and that may not help because they may only spend a month in the MPA area, and overall that's not.
We do see commercial fishermen just saying "puh," you know. I know the last year or so it's been a big issue in French Polynesia, where they do have established marine protected areas, that commercial fishing fleets from Japan and Indonesia were coming up, either sitting right on the line of that protected area, and some illegally coming into it. And they had evidence of that through ship tracking and all that different GPS coordinates and things like that. So
I think one thing too would be,
it's just regulation. It's ultimately just comes down, it's really hard to regulate. It's really hard to regulate.
They touched on how they'll fine them, but it's always like, give them a bigger fine. That's my thought. Is a lot of time, I mean, obviously, like there is also going to be like human issues where a lot of times a lot of these men that may be breaching these areas are almost forced to, because they have to feed their family, and that's horrible. And that's like, that gets talked about with Project Hugh. Yeah, and they talk about the human rights issues, that it is so hard to even broad stroke saying something like give them bigger fines, because some of these men may just be so desperate that that's their only solution to bring home a fish or a shark that's going to make money to feed their family. And it is so nuanced. Yeah. But I do think that for bigger things, like obviously there are ships that are hitting that gray zone or breaching, to find them big time.
Yeah, ultimately what ended up happening is we had commercial fishing. It's not a new phenomenon. Commercial fishing's been around forever. However, as our technology got better, as our fishing methods got better, or we were able to catch more, we didn't learn how to do that. We were able to catch more, so we did. We never stopped and thought about, should we?
Yeah. I think Sylvia Earle talks about that in Mission Blue, how, and even in this, how just technology improved, that we just deplete faster than it can bounce back. And that's why we got to like start acting now to stop, because they won't be able to bounce back. Yeah. I mean, we're so good at what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote in my notes, it's all about economics. It's all about the money. You know, it comes down to, can we create, instead of subsidizing commercial fishing to make it easier for them to fish, can we subsidize them for not fishing? Yeah. Or, you know, can we reward people for using more sustainable methods, or for not overcatching, or for following catch limits, or, you know, whatever it is? Can we create a better way to enforce and regulate and create? Not only do we need to create the law to begin with, but can we find better ways to initiate and
Yeah.
regulate and all that kind of stuff.
And that's where I think people might watch it and think, oh, well, what's that going to do if I just don't eat fish? They're still fishing. But the goal is if enough people did stop, it would hit their pockets and then they would make a change. That's the thing. Places, people, corporations make changes when their pockets hit.
Yeah.
And that's why it is like I understand why they will say don't eat fish. And for some people, they may have to think about it as it's not long term. The goal would be not to eat fish for short term, so we could implement better sustainable guidelines to then be able to return, because fish could be a great resource. In terms
and there's a huge
of,
portion of the population of the world that relies on seafood as their primary source of protein.
It's definitely not those people that should be told not to eat seafood. It's those of us who are very privileged and eat it for like their fancy meal at Red Lobster. Fish was always fancy for my house. It was like, ooh, we're having fish, we're having seafood. Obviously, I am not relying on that. It is my like, oh, I love going to Bubba Gump's and eating my shrimp. It's so yummy. Yeah. I'm very like, it's a very privileged standpoint to be able to even say, do not eat seafood.
Oh yeah, of course.
And that I can easily just be like, okay, I have mushrooms, I have chicken. Even
I think
like,
that's more, we're
else.
not talking about the third world countries where people are struggling to feed themselves. We're talking about the big industries that are taking fish out of those third world countries, oceans, to feed people,
which they bring
like
up
myself,
with like
like yourself,
Africa,
like our nation, that if nothing else, we just don't need to consume as much as we do.
And that is the issue of broad stroking, saying don't eat fish, because people might turn your words and be like, oh, well, some people can't not eat fish. Obviously, I'm not talking to you.
Yeah.
I am talking to other people like me who are just going to get sushi at Fry's because I'm craving it, not because I need my protein for the day.
Yeah. And they do talk a little bit about like bioaccumulation and biomagnification, which is obviously, not good.
And I like the fish farm because fish farming is an issue up here. BC is phasing out our salmon farms because the salmon actually, they didn't talk about this, but it is really important. Salmon that have that lice and all those genetic issues will pass on to the, and that's what's happening out here with things like Chinook and coho salmon. And it is impacting the dwindling population of wild salmon we already have. Yeah. And that is why the fish farms, it's so important to phase them out.
I mean, here
and there are so many great resources
Big Island,
to learn about that.
We have the Kampachi and Mempachi fish farms. And the reality is that those fish are probably more sustainable than if they were going out and fishing every single day. But it doesn't mean that it's the best option that we have. So I think that's where it kind of comes back into that gray area that we already talked about. And I'm sure it vastly varies on how sustainable farmed fish can even be, depending on where you are in the world. And
like, maybe even example, how
it's probably worse
the industry grows.
Right.
Like seeing where like farmed fishing may be a big issue when there's not like maybe proper waste management, health of the fish, but there could potentially be a great way to learn from this and to invest money into it, to come up with technologies and better nets
to make it better for the environment.
I mean, the same with fishing. I think in the post I got hate on, I shared that there was great chance and great opportunity to start investing in better alternatives for fishing, for catching fish and crab and crustaceans and all that kind of stuff. And that we don't need to see it as an outright no fish, no fishing, but people can see it as a motivator to come up with a solution that we can continue to eat this food many of us enjoy and many of us rely on, but to not have such a harmful impact. And I think that's another great way to kind of turn it to make people feel better, is saying like, come up with a solution then.
Yeah. So I think that's more what it is. It's more say, hey, the system that we have right now does not work, or it's causing more harm than it is good. How can we slowly tilt that scale to where instead of it doing worse than it is causing better, we slowly kind of bring it to where, there might be some things that aren't great about it, but ultimately it's a lot better, like cost benefit analysis, Yeah.
And I think the point with the food that he brought up was really good, where he talks about how feeding the fish other fish is then supporting the fishing. So that's something like, find a solution to that.
Right.
And that instead of seeing that and maybe there are fish farms that don't rely on food that is created by industrial fishing. Maybe they are purely coming from a different source.
Right.
And that's something that, as people who are watching this and watch the film, to maybe, if you are wanting to eat seafood, to like look at biologists who may be sharing information about how to get sustainable seafood, because there may be fish farms that are doing that already.
Right. I would agree. It's not the last thing they cover in the documentary. It's the last thing that I could remember because I was sobbing for basically the rest of it.
Yeah.
They talk about the Faroe Islands and how it claims to be the only sustainable whaling practice in the world. And then
I would compute that, just because I think of the smaller native populations.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Up here in Canada.
They posted, they showed some article title or whatever on
they did.
and that's and they show some pretty graphic footage of the hunt in the Faroe Islands and killing the pilot whales, which made me cry a lot. I
also cried a lot.
So,
and I think you knew about it before.
Yes, I was aware of the Faroe Islands and the hunting and killing that they do there. I've had a petition on my website for a long time to encourage the community to think twice about it and talk to officials about maybe putting in better regulation on it if they are going to continue to do it, all that kind of stuff. So I've known about it for a few years now, actually.
Yeah.
I will be honest, this is the first time I've seen footage of the actual slaughter itself. I had seen, I don't know why, for whatever reason, it was just so much worse to me than like Taiji. I don't know if it's because I've seen that footage from Taiji so much that I'm like more desensitized to it.
I think it's the perspective as well. I think if it was an underwater perspective of the, maybe on the boats in the water of the Taiji situation, that it would be more emotional, but they're like right up. You can hear the pilot whales.
Just the way they like
on the baby, you can see it was so young that it still had its folds from being in the womb almost. Like that's how young that baby was.
Like just sliced their heads open.
Yeah.
And like I'm gonna cry again, like just thinking about it. And I don't know, and I think part of it is because I've swam with pilots, because I've seen them in the ocean and made eye contact with that animal in front of me. I don't know if that's why seeing it was so difficult. I don't know what it was, because I see people throw sharks all the time, and I swim with sharks.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's maybe because I'm more like desensitized to it in the sense that I know it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it could have been the way it was shot too. Like it just literally felt like you were standing there watching it happen, the way that it was shot.
I think for me it was like a lot of the hearing the calls. I mean, I was crying as well. I sent you the video. Yeah. But hearing the clicks and the it may have been an overlay of audio, but I think it was genuine. I do think it was real. Maybe that will come to light that it's not. Either way, it was very emotional because they are very cognitive animals. I mean, pilot whales are known to beach as a whole group, even when one has an issue, and they'll all beach themselves and die. This happens in New Zealand. They are so connected. There's theories that their sense of self is literally within a group setting, so they are not themselves without their family. And then sitting there, and I mean,
I've been in the water and seen like male pilots put themselves between me and their women and their young.
Yeah.
Like it's just so sad.
Yeah. No, I was weeping, and I've watched a lot about, I know a lot about it, and I've seen footage of it happening. Like first, I've seen footage exactly like that before. And there's even more issues to the grind that they don't bring up in the Faroe Islands, like that they'll discard a lot of the bodies and don't even eat them. And that even doctors advise not to eat them because they're so polluted. Like women are not supposed to eat the pilot whales. flesh.
And I
So
mean,
it's
to the
kind of
point
like,
the fisherman made, he was saying, well, it's better I kill one whale than 2,000 cats, or, you know, whatever it
which is
was.
fair. I
Which
mean,
is a
and
fair
I think the
argument.
fisherman has a great point, and that's like what my teacher would always bring up about like, don't get picky, like a whale, a chicken, a cow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I feel about a lot of like native populations that truly rely on like eating beluga, eating
Yeah.
different animals
Well,
that
people
we
just eat different things in
animals.
different countries, no matter what.
Yeah, but I was kind of intrigued they didn't bring up the issue of pollutants in the pilot whales, and that a lot of them do get discarded, and that they don't genuinely always eat them, because they very much set it up that the Faroe people will eat them all, but that's not what happens.
They killed a lot.
They kill a lot, and this is a small island.
They killed a lot of them,
and a lot get dumped. And they don't bring, and I was very shocked they did not bring that up. But it was the end of the film, and they were ending.
Yeah.
So
it was just it was hard to watch, and it made me sob, and like even thinking about it still does.
I did like the fisherman's perspective at the end, though. I think it did bring up a good point, as we tend to be very picky of what animals we care about.
Right. And I mean, it's easy to fall. I mean, and we see it with sharks, you know, like it's easy to fall in love with a dolphin, not as easy to fall in love with the man-eating machine of the ocean, you know, whether that's true or not. And yeah, he says, he's like, well, you guys kill 10 bajillion fish. Why can I not kill this one whale? You know, like to that point, which is a fair argument. Doesn't make it any easier to watch.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And I think for me personally, and we've talked about it, that just because I care about the ocean doesn't mean that I don't care about the rainforest, or don't care about the Arctic, or, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But
it's so hard to cover everything.
I cannot care about every single issue on this planet, whether it be ecosystem, humanitarian issues, you know, like I physically cannot, I do not have the capacity to wear a backpack with all of it. You know, I can only use my efforts for so much. However, the ocean covers 70% of our planet. It provides so many unbelievable resources. It's being decimated at a rate 10 bajillion times faster than a lot of other issues on our planet. Yeah. I just personally don't understand how you cannot care about the ocean. I don't know.
I think it's just because I don't know if it's that they don't care, but it's not as tangible. That's one thing that it always, I feel like, comes down to. People don't care about the stuff that they don't have experience with. And they don't immediately get gratification from. And even like deep sea mining is a big thing that is trying to get stopped before it becomes a thing currently, but people don't care about the deep sea. And so it's really hard to get a big public outcry. People don't care about like these trawling because you're not down there. It's not personally affecting you. I mean, it will personally affect you eventually, but at the moment it's not. Yeah. And it's a matter, I think, of almost like we have to market the ocean a certain way. We need to get on top of marketing these areas to get people to care. It's not innate. It's not like,
but I thought it was a good documentary. To your point, I don't think it's perfect.
Yeah.
I definitely think
I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to learn more about the I don't want to say faults in it, but just maybe where it missed and where people might be able to correct some of the claims.
Right.
So I think overall, a lot of people are saying, yeah, like what they're saying is not wrong, but there's nuance, and they want to talk about it and kind of say that, and people may share like the harmful impacts of broad stroking such an issue can do. So I'm excited to hear more about what people have to say in response to the film.
And Kendra is going to do a podcast with a fisheries expert, kind of talking about the documentary and just fisheries in general. So I'll make sure that I link that in the description below this video as well. If you had to rate the documentary out of 10, what do you think you would give it?
I think currently, with the information I know now, 8 or 9.
Okay, I was going to say
maybe a 9, but it may change upon, I don't know. I think still a 9.
I was gonna say a 7 or an 8, leaning more towards an 8. And the only reason I went as low as that was simply because I felt like it could have done a better job of giving more solution. Not necessarily like
Yeah, okay,
different
yeah, for that
solutions.
I want to go down to an 8.
Like maybe not like different solutions, but they spent obviously
More.
like the documentary did a very good job of covering a ton of information.
So
Like,
much.
it did one of the best jobs, honestly, that I've seen in most documentaries that I've watched of talking about multiple issues and how they all relate back to maybe their focus issue. However, I wish that they would have, it was like the last 60 seconds and they didn't even say it. It was literally just like a pop-up on the
Don't eat
screen
fish.
of
Go to our
text.
website.
Right. And so I feel like it would have been worth literally 5 minutes, 10 minutes max, you know? Just maybe explaining how you as an individual or just like what organizations can do to be better. Yeah. And maybe they didn't have the answer and maybe that's why they didn't really
I really do think
it,
because it's Cowspiracy and Sea Shepherd that their message was to just not eat fish and go vegan.
Yeah, which is fine if that's the message.
But I think it would have been great if they had more.
And they did talk about that one. I thought it was cool. The one company that's making like plant-based seafood alternatives.
Yes, I love plant-based seafood. Oh my goodness, it's
I feel
so
like
yummy.
It's kind of easy.
A lot of it's mushrooms. Yeah, there's the tofu. Tofu can make great seafood alternative. It just is what you flavor it with.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that like there's definitely really a lot of good alternatives out there. And I think the documentary did a good job of presenting the issue as a whole and all the different aspects of it. Yeah, I would say like an 8. Yeah. I would definitely, like I said, I think everyone should watch this documentary.
Yeah, I think everyone should watch it. And be open. That's my biggest thing.
Yes.
But yeah, I think an 8 is good as well.
Yeah. Well, next episode, we are going to do another fun one since this was a little bit more serious. We are going to be doing the mockumentary Mermaids Bodies Found.
Yes. I'm so excited to rewatch this.
We're really excited. I actually don't think I've ever seen it, or if I have, I haven't watched it since I was in.
You're going to have a lot of fun.
Or something.
But
I'm
so
excited.
Funny.
I can't wait to crap all over it. It's going to be a great time. So if you want to join our discussion about that, make sure you watch it and stay up to date. If you want to subscribe to the YouTube channel or just keep an eye out on both of our Instagrams, we're always sharing when the next episode is going to come out, what we're going to be discussing. But yeah, until then, we will see you guys next time.